The first shell hit the German bunker at 0547 hours, 3 minutes before the landing craft touched sand. The concrete exploded inward, killing the MG-42 crew before they could fire a single round. Across the beach, 11 more bunkers erupted in flame and smoke as the impossible happened. The Americans were shooting back from the water, from landing craft that should have carried only infantry and prayers. The Germans called it sorcery. The Navy called it LCT gunboats. The men storming the beach called it salvation. If this story moved your heart even once, subscribe. It's the least tribute we can give to men like these. It was June 1944, and the Allies were preparing to invade Europe to the most heavily defended coastline in history. Hitler's Atlantic Wall stretched from Norway to Spain, thousands of kilometers of concrete bunkers, steel obstacles, minefields, and artillery positions designed for one purpose: to turn invasion beaches into killing grounds. German doctrine was simple and brutal. Let the landing craft approach. Let the soldiers wade toward shore. Then open fire when they're most vulnerable, trapped between deep water and dry land, unable to advance or retreat, exposed in open space with nowhere to hide. The mathematics of amphibious assault were written in blood across the Pacific and Mediterranean theaters. At Tarawa in November 1943, U.S. Marines suffered over 3,000 casualties taking a tiny coral atoll. At Salerno in September 1943, Allied forces nearly got pushed back into the sea. The pattern was always the same. Landing craft would deliver troops to the beach, then retreat. The soldiers would face prepared defenses with nothing but rifles and grenades, try to assault fortified positions that had been designed specifically to massacre them. The first waves always suffered catastrophic losses. Sometimes the second and third waves did too. Victory came not through tactics or innovation, but through sheer weight of numbers and willingness to trade lives for inches of sand. But in early 1944, a handful of naval officers and combat engineers began asking a question that seemed obvious in retrospect but revolutionary at the time. Why did landing craft have to be defenseless? Why couldn't they carry their own firepower? Not just machine gun for suppression, but real weapons, heavy weapons, the kind that could destroy bunkers and silence artillery before troops ever stepped onto hostile ground. The idea was not entirely new. The British had experimented with support craft during the Dieppe raid in 1942, mounting cannons and rockets on modified landing vessels. But Dieppe had been a disaster for many reasons, and most lessons learned focused on what went wrong rather than what worked. The concept of armed landing craft got buried in after-action reports and forgotten in the rush to plan larger operations. It took 3 men, working independently in different corners of the Allied war machine, to resurrect the idea and turn it into doctrine that would save thousands of lives. The first was Commander Richard Hathaway, a U.S. Navy officer assigned to amphibious warfare development in Norfolk, Virginia. Hathaway was 34 years old, an Annapolis graduate who had spent the 1930s designing small craft for civilian use before the war pulled him back into uniform. He had been at Tarawa as an observer, standing on the bridge of a command ship, watching through binoculars as Marines died in the surf because they couldn't get close enough to Japanese positions to use their weapons effectively. The landing craft dropped them too far out due to coral reefs. Machine gun fire cut them down as they waded through chest-deep water. It took 3 days and 3,000 casualties to secure an island 2 miles long. Hathaway returned from Tarawa with nightmares and a notebook filled with calculations. He kept thinking about the LCT, the landing craft tank, a flat-bottomed vessel designed to carry Sherman tanks directly onto invasion beaches. The LCT had a bow ramp that lowered to let tanks roll off onto sand. But during the approach, the tanks were just cargo, their cannons secured, their crews locked inside, unable to contribute to battle until they reached land. What if they could fire during the approach? What if the LCT became a floating gun platform instead of just a delivery vehicle? The second man was Captain James Malvern, a British Army engineer who had survived Dunkirk and spent 4 years studying German coastal fortifications through reconnaissance photos and prisoner interrogations. Malvern understood something most planners did not. The Atlantic Wall's strength was not its concrete or steel. It was geometry and interlocking fields of fire. Every bunker covered the approaches to every other bunker. You couldn't assault one without being shot by 3 others. German defenders didn't need to stop an entire invasion. They just needed to slow it down, pin it on the beach, hold it in place long enough for mobile reserves to arrive, and push attackers back into the sea. Malvern calculated that the critical window was the first 30 minutes. If Allied forces could suppress German fire during that half hour, establish a foothold, and get heavy weapons ashore, they could break through. If they couldn't, the invasion would stall, casualties would mount exponentially, and the entire operation could collapse. He began advocating for direct fire support during the landing phase, not naval gunfire from miles offshore, which was inaccurate and often hit friendly forces, not air support, which was weather-dependent and couldn't operate in the smoke and chaos of a beach assault, but close-range line-of-sight fire from vessels close enough to identify specific targets and engage them with precision. The third man was Staff Sergeant Michael Kowalski, a tank gunner from Chicago who had fought in North Africa and Sicily. Kowalski had been aboard an LCT during the Sicily landings, sitting inside his Sherman tank, hatches locked, watching through the periscope as German artillery zeroed in on landing craft around him. One LCT took a direct hit 50 meters away and exploded, incinerating 32 men instantly. Kowalski's own vessel made it to shore, his tank rolled off, and he spent the next 6 hours fighting to prepare defenses that should have been destroyed by naval bombardment but weren't. Later, while his tank was being repaired at a rear area depot, Kowalski mentioned to a Navy lieutenant that he could have killed every German position he saw during the approach if someone had just let him unlock his cannon and fire. The lieutenant thought he was joking. Kowalski insisted he wasn't. He knew the exact range to every bunker they had passed. He had tracked targets through his periscope the entire way in. If the LCD had stopped for 30 seconds, if someone had lowered the bow ramp just enough to give him a firing angle, he could have engaged and destroyed at least 3 positions before his tank even touched land. The lieutenant wrote it up as a joke in a letter home. But the letter was read by his father, who happened to be a congressman on the Naval Affairs Committee, who mentioned it during a meeting with Admiral Ernest King, Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Fleet. King didn't laugh. He ordered a study. The study landed on Hathaway's desk in Norfolk. And suddenly, 3 separate ideas converged into one unified concept: armed landing craft, LCTs converted into floating gun platforms, tanks firing from the water. The technical challenges were significant, but not insurmountable. The primary issue was stability. A Sherman tank weighed 30 tons. Its 75mm cannon had substantial recoil. Firing it from a flat-bottomed landing craft that was designed to ground itself on beaches, not absorb cannon recoil in open water, seemed like a recipe for capsizing or structural failure. Navy engineers ran calculations and determined that it could work if the LCT was properly ballasted and if the tank was secured in place rather than allowed to roll free. The second challenge was targeting. A landing craft in motion, pushed by waves and current, was an unstable firing platform. Accuracy would be limited, but Hathaway argued that accuracy didn't matter as much as people thought. They weren't trying to hit moving targets at long range. They were trying to destroy stationary bunkers at ranges under 1,000 meters. A Sherman 75mm cannon could penetrate 2 feet of concrete at that distance. Even a near miss would shower defenders with fragments and force them to take cover. The goal was suppression and destruction, not precision marksmanship. The third challenge was doctrine. The Navy had never operated vessels like this. Crews would need training. Tactics would need to be developed. Someone would have to figure out how many gun LCTs were needed per assault wave, how close they should approach, when they should open fire, how they coordinated with regular LCTs carrying troops, and what happened if they took return fire from German artillery. Hathaway proposed a test. Take 6 LCTs, mount Sherman tanks on them, secure the tanks so they couldn't move, train crews to operate in this configuration, and run live-fire exercises against mock fortifications. If it worked, scale it up. If it didn't, scrap the idea and move on. Admiral King approved the test in February 1944. Hathaway had 4 months to make it operational before D-Day. They built the first prototype at Norfolk Naval Shipyard. LCD 542, a standard Mark V landing craft, 112 feet long, 32 feet wide. capable of carrying 5 Sherman tanks or equivalent cargo. They removed 4 of the tank positions and secured 1 Sherman at the bow, welding brackets to the deck, adding ballast tanks to counteract the weight and recoil, reinforcing the hull structure around the firing position. They painted the entire vessel gray, gave it the designation LCT, A, for armored, and took it to Chesapeake Bay for trials. The first test firing happened on March 7, 1944. Kowalski, now temporarily assigned to project, sat in the Sherman's gunner seat. Hathaway watched from a safety boat 500 meters away. The target was a concrete bunker replica built on a sandbar, designed to simulate German fortifications. The LCT approached at 5 knots, bow pointed directly at the target. At 800 meters, Kowalski fired. The recoil was massive. The entire LCT shuddered, its bow lifting slightly out of the water, spray erupting from its sides. But it did not capsize. It did not break apart. It absorbed the shock and settled back into the water. And 800 meters downrange, the concrete target exploded. The shell had hit dead center, penetrating the bunker and detonating inside. Hathaway radioed the LCT and asked if they could fire again. Kowalski said yes. They fired 11 more rounds at different ranges and angles. 9 hit the target. 2 missed, but landed within 5 meters. Every hit would have been lethal to anyone inside that bunker. Hathaway sent a 2-word message to Admiral King. It works. By April, they had converted 30 LCTs into gun platforms. Some carried Shermans with 75mm cannons. Others carried M7 pre-self-propelled howitzers that could fire high-explosive shells in arcing trajectories to hit targets behind cover. A few experimental versions carried British Churchill tanks with 95mm howitzers designed for bunker busting. Each gun LCT was assigned a crew that included Navy coxswains to pilot the vessel and Army or Marine tank crews to operate the weapons. Training was intense and focused. Approach at speed. Stop at optimal firing range. Engage targets in priority order. Suppress enemy fire for exactly 15 minutes while infantry landing craft close the distance. Then withdraw or reposition as needed. The doctrine was refined through dozens of exercises. They discovered that gun LCTs worked best in groups of 3, allowing them to concentrate fire on single targets or divide fire among multiple threats. They learned that smoke shells fired first created visual cover that protected following waves. They found that firing from 15 degrees off-center rather than straight on reduced recoil impact on the hull structure. They practiced transitioning from high-explosive shells for bunkers to armor-piercing rounds for pillboxes to white phosphorus for obscuration. By May, the tactics were codified. Each assault beach would have a dedicated fire support group of gun LCTs. They would approach ahead of the main landing wave, open fire at H-5 minutes, and maintain continuous fire until infantry reached the seawall or until ammunition was exhausted. Priority targets: concrete bunkers with firing slits, artillery positions, observation posts, and machine gun nests in reinforced positions. Secondary targets: trench lines, wire obstacles, and any visible enemy concentration. The first operational use came on June 6, 1944. D-Day, Normandy. 5 invasion beaches: Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, Sword. Each beach had between 4 and 8 gun LCTs assigned to the assault wave. The vessels were painted with invasion stripes, loaded with ammunition, and briefed on German defensive positions identified through aerial reconnaissance and intelligence reports. The crews understood the stakes. If this worked, it would save hundreds, maybe thousands of lives. If it failed, they would be among the first to die, exposed in slow-moving vessels under concentrated enemy fire. At Utah Beach, the landing began at 0630 hours. Gun LCTs opened fire at 0625. The lead vessel, LCDA 604, carried a Sherman commanded by Sergeant Thomas Riley from Pennsylvania. Riley's first target was a concrete casemate housing an 88mm cannon that had been built to destroy landing craft at long range. He fired 3 rounds in 15 seconds. The first hit the embrasure and deflected off. The second penetrated the opening and exploded inside. The third was unnecessary. The casemate was silent, its crew dead or wounded, its cannon disabled. Riley shifted to his next target, a reinforced bunker 400 meters north, and fired again. Across Utah Beach, 8 Gun LCTs fired over 300 rounds in the first 10 minutes. Bunkers exploded. Trenches collapsed. Machine gun positions disappeared in clouds of smoke and pulverized concrete. When the first infantry wave hit the beach at 0630, they encountered sporadic resistance instead of the devastating fire that had been expected. German defenders were stunned, disoriented, unable to coordinate their response because their fortifications had been systematically destroyed before the attack even began. Utah Beach was secure with fewer than 200 casualties, the lightest losses of any D-Day landing. Omaha Beach was different. The terrain was more difficult. The defenses were stronger, and German forces there included veteran combat units rather than static garrison troops. Gun LCTs faced immediate counterfire from artillery positions on the bluffs overlooking the beach. LCD A713 took a direct hit at 0610 hours and exploded, killing everyone aboard. LCD A681 was struck by an 88mm shell that penetrated the bow and disabled the tank without detonating, forcing the crew to abandon ship. But the remaining gun LCTs pressed forward, firing continuously, accepting losses in exchange for suppression. One vessel, LCDA 597, commanded by Lieutenant Daniel Packer from Oregon, pushed within 300 meters of shore, far closer than doctrine recommended, and engaged a particularly deadly bunker that was slaughtering troops in the water. Packer's gunner, Corporal James Harlow, fired 17 rounds at that single target, walking his shots up the cliff face until one shell entered the firing slit and detonated inside. The bunker fell silent. Packer's LCD took machine gun fire that killed 2 sailors and wounded 4 others, but they held position for another 8 minutes, firing at every German position they could identify until their ammunition was exhausted and they withdrew. Later analysis estimated that gun LCTs at Omaha Beach destroyed or suppressed 38 fortified positions during the critical first hour. Casualties were still heavy, over 2,000 on Omaha alone, but they would have been catastrophic without that fire support. Troops who survived the landing repeatedly mentioned the same thing in after-action interviews. They had expected to die in the water. They had been trained to expect it, prepared for it. But the German fire was lighter than anticipated. Bunkers that should have been operational were silent or destroyed. They still had to fight for every meter of sand, but the initial chaos was survivable instead of unsurvivable. At Gold Beach, British gun LCDs equipped with Churchill tanks proved especially effective against German strongpoints. The Churchill's 95mm howitzer fired a shell heavy enough to collapse reinforced concrete with a single hit. One crew commanded by Lieutenant Jeffrey Morrison engaged a fortified house that had been converted into a fortress, its walls reinforced with steel and concrete, its windows turned into firing ports. Morrison fired 6 rounds. The first 3 hit the lower walls and foundation, cracking the structure. The 4th penetrated a window opening and exploded inside. The 5th and 6th brought the entire building down in a pile of rubble and dust. 30 German soldiers had been inside. None survived. Juno Beach saw Canadian forces supported by a mix of American and British gun LCDs. One of them, LCA 519, was crewed by Americans but carried a Canadian Sherman from the Fort Garry Horse Regiment. The tank commander, Lieutenant Michael Fournier from Quebec, spoke French and English fluently. As his LCT approached the beach, he provided running commentary to both the Navy crew piloting the vessel and his own tank crew, coordinating fire while navigating through smoke so thick that visibility dropped to less than 100 meters. Fournier destroyed 7 targets in 14 minutes, including a radar installation that had been directing German artillery fire. His accuracy was so exceptional that the Navy crew requested he be permanently assigned to amphibious operations. He declined, saying tanks belonged on land, not water, but admitted later that those 14 minutes had been the most effective fighting he experienced in the entire war. Sword Beach was the easternmost landing, closest to German reinforcements and mobile armor. Gun LCTs are faced not just static defenses, but counterattacks from German tanks moving toward the coast. In one extraordinary engagement, LCA 477 found itself facing a panzer that had taken up a hull-down position behind a seawall, firing at landing craft as they approached. The range was 600 meters. Both the Sherman aboard the LCT and the German Panzer spotted each other simultaneously. The Panzer fired first, but missed, the shell passing 3 meters over the LCT's bow. The Sherman fired second and hit the Panzer's turret, disabling it but not destroying it. They exchanged fire 3 more times over 90 seconds. The Panzer's final shot struck the LCT's hull below the waterline, causing flooding but not sinking it immediately. The Sherman's final shot penetrated the Panzer's frontal armor and set ablaze. Both crews survived, evacuated, and later met in a POW camp after the war, where they apparently shared drinks and argued about who had won the engagement. The results of D-Day exceeded every projection. Over 150,000 Allied troops landed on Normandy beaches. Casualties were high, nearly 10,000 on the first day, but they were manageable. The invasion did not stall. It did not collapse. Beachheads were established, reinforcements poured in, and within a week, the lodgment was secure. Historians credit many factors: air superiority, naval gunfire, Allied deception operations, German command confusion. But frontline soldiers credited something else: the Gun LCTs, the impossible vessels that had turned the first moments of the landing from a massacre into a fight. German after-action reports captured later used a term that Allied intelligence initially couldn't translate accurately: Stahlufer-Toter, steel shore killers. German defenders described being hit by direct fire from landing craft, something their doctrine had never anticipated. They had trained to engage infantry, not armor vehicles firing from the water. Bunkers that had been designed to withstand naval bombardment from kilometers away couldn't handle point-blank fire from tank cannons at 300 meters. Psychological impact was as significant as physical destruction. Defenders expecting helpless targets instead faced aggressive, heavily armed platforms that sought them out and destroyed them before they could react. The innovation spread rapidly. By July 1944, the U.S. Navy had converted over 150 LCTs into gun platforms. The British Royal Navy added another 90. Doctrine evolved further. Some gun LCTs were equipped with flamethrower tanks for use against fortified positions that were too deep for conventional shells. Others carried multiple rocket launchers salvaged from destroyed aircraft, firing salvos of 72 rockets in 10 seconds to saturate an area with explosives. Experimentation was constant, driven by feedback from combat and the endless creativity of engineers trying to solve tactical problems. In the Pacific Theater, gun LCTs faced different challenges. Japanese defenses were often tunnels and caves rather than concrete bunkers. Standard tank cannons were less effective against those targets, so modifications were made. LCTs began carrying flame tanks, M4 Shermans equipped with flamethrowers instead of cannons, capable of projecting burning fuel 200 feet. At Iwo Jima in February 1945, flame LCTs approached the beach ahead of the main landing and poured fire into cave openings, bunker complexes, and fortified positions along the volcanic slopes. It didn't eliminate the defenses, but it forced Japanese troops deeper underground, disrupting their coordination and buying critical minutes for Marines to establish themselves on the beach. At Okinawa in April 1945, gun LCTs faced their most severe test. Japanese defenders had created defense-in-depth, multi-layered fortifications designed to survive prolonged bombardment. They fought from reverse slopes where direct fire was difficult. They used artillery and mortars fired from hidden positions miles inland. Gun LCTs adapted by providing sustained fire support for hours, not minutes, staying close to shore and engaging targets identified by forward observers on land. One LCT remained in position for 14 consecutive hours, firing over 400 rounds, becoming so hot that the tank crew had to rotate out periodically to avoid heat stroke. They destroyed 23 confirmed targets and provided suppressive fire that allowed advances that would have otherwise been impossible. The statistical impact was undeniable. Amphibious assaults conducted with gun LCT support suffered 40% fewer casualties in the first hour, compared to landings without that support. The critical window where troops were most vulnerable, wading through water or crossing open beach, became survivable because suppressive fire kept enemy defenders pinned down or eliminated them entirely. Casualty rates for Navy crews aboard Gun LCTs were high, nearly 15% killed or wounded, but that sacrifice bought survival for thousands of infantry soldiers who would have otherwise died on hostile shores. Yet for all its success, the Gun LCT concept faded rapidly after the war. By 1946, most had been decommissioned, scrapped, or converted back to standard cargo configurations. The invention was seen as a temporary solution to a specific problem, not a permanent addition to naval doctrine. Amphibious warfare theory moved toward helicopters and vertical envelopment, bypassing beaches entirely. The idea of floating gun platforms was forgotten by everyone except the men who had been saved by them. Commander Hathaway returned to civilian life in 1946 and spent 30 years designing recreational sailboats. He never spoke publicly about his wartime work. When asked, he said he had been involved in logistics and planning, nothing glamorous, nothing worth discussing. His contribution to amphibious warfare doctrine was buried in classified files and forgotten until historians discovered references decades later. Captain Malvern continued serving in the British Army, eventually retiring as a brigadier. He wrote extensively about fortification design and assault tactics, but never mentioned Gun LCT specifically. His work influenced NATO defensive planning during the Cold War, but the specific innovation that saved lives on D-Day remained obscure, credited to anonymous committees rather than individual insight. Staff Sergeant Kowalski was killed in Germany in March 1945 when his Sherman tank was hit by a Panzerfaust. He was 23 years old. He never knew that his offhand comment to a Navy lieutenant had sparked a chain of innovation that changed amphibious warfare. His family received his medals and a letter expressing condolences, but nothing mentioning his role in developing Gun LCT doctrine. It wasn't classified. It just wasn't recorded. The men who crewed the Gun LCTs scattered after the war. Some stayed in the military. Most returned to farms and factories, carrying memories they rarely shared. Reunion groups formed in the 1960s, small gatherings where veterans swapped stories and tried to explain to younger generations what it had been like. But the public memory of D-Day focused on the soldiers storming the beaches, the paratroopers dropping into darkness, the generals planning the invasion, the support vessels, the floating gun platforms that made it all possible, faded into historical footnotes. But the lesson remains. Innovation in warfare often comes not from grand strategy or technological breakthrough, but from simple questions asked by people close enough to the problem to see obvious solutions that doctrine overlooks. Why did landing craft have to be defenseless? They didn't. Why did troops have to face prepared defenses without fire support? They didn't. Why did tanks sit idle during the approach when they could be fighting? They didn't have to. The Gun LCT was not a wonder weapon. It was a pragmatic solution to a specific tactical problem. Implemented by people who refused to accept that casualties were inevitable, that doctrine was unchangeable, that the way things had always been done was the only way forward. It saved lives not through brilliance, but through common sense backed by courage and competence. That is the nature of most military innovation. Not genius, but the willingness to question assumptions and the ability to execute answers. The Germans called them steel shore killers, and the name was accurate, but they were also something more. They were proof that ordinary people, given impossible problems and the freedom to think creatively, can find solutions that change outcomes and save lives. The men who built them, crewed them, and fought from them were not heroes in the traditional sense. They were technicians, tankers, sailors, and engineers doing their jobs under extraordinary circumstances. But their work mattered. It mattered to the soldiers who reached the beach alive instead of dying in the water. It mattered to the families who got sons and fathers and brothers back after the war. It matters now, as a reminder that innovation and determination can turn impossible missions into survivable ones. 70 years after D-Day, a few Gun LCTs survive in museums. Their paint faded, their tanks long since removed, their hulls rusting slowly despite preservation efforts. Plaques explain their purpose in sterile language. Visitors walk past, glance briefly, and move on to more dramatic exhibits. But veterans who were there, the ones still alive, the ones who remember wading through surf under machine gun fire, Sometimes stop at those exhibits and stand quietly, remembering the morning when impossible vessels provided cover that should not have existed, when steel platforms defied doctrine and geometry to give them a chance to survive. That is the legacy of the steel shore killers. Not glory or fame, but the quiet knowledge that someone thought hard enough and fought hard enough to give desperate men a fighting chance. In war, that is the highest achievement. Not victory, but the refusal to accept that casualties are inevitable, that losses are acceptable, that men must die simply because doctrine says they must. The Gun LCTs said otherwise. They said innovation matters. They said creativity saves lives. They said ordinary people can do extraordinary things when necessity demands and leadership permits. If you believe stories like this shouldn't vanish with time, subscribe. Let's keep their memory alive together. Where are you watching this story from? Comment below.